Let's go ahead and kick things off. Welcome. My name is Diana Wynand. I'm the chair of the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter. We have a great show tonight. Great show. I feel like it's going to be a show because we're going to kick back and we're going to learn a lot. It's going to be informative, and I know it's one of my favorite subjects, which coral reefs, because I'm a snorkeler and a kayaker. So I love the water, and now we get to dive under and learn more and hopefully learn some hopeful things about what's being done, at least in Dr. Sandin's world. So we're really looking forward to that. We always like to kick off with a land acknowledgement. So Christy, I'm going to pitch it to you to give our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. Our land acknowledgement is a formal statement that's recognizing and respecting the Indigenous people as stewards of this land and honoring their enduring relationship that exists between the Indigenous people of this land and all land in the states and their traditional territories. It's acknowledging the history that brought us to reside on this land, as well as the colonialism that is very present still in our current systems. Our land acknowledgement is calling on us to be mindful of our own present participation in colonialism and colonization of this land. Our hope is that through this acknowledgement, we will honor the traditional territories of the Tongva, Kitch, Tootavim, and Chumash tribes, not only with our words, but also with our actions, to walk beside them, to learn from them, and to get back to the way things used to be in relationship with nature and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. We appreciate that. We like to share some of our social media. So Terry, can I pitch it to you to let folks know what's going to be coming up next month?
Of course. So June 14th, we'll have the LADWP here. They'll provide an update on the LA 100's renewable study, which confirmed LA can reach 100% renewable by 2035. And they'll also discuss a new initiative called the LA 100 Equity Strategy. And this was created to ensure that the path to 100% carbon-free energy is equitable as well as achievable. And it's being conducted by the NREL and UCLA's Luskin Center of Innovation. And it brings together LA-based community justice organizations and stakeholders. And I'll post a link to that in the chat. In addition, we'll discuss the LA 100, in addition to the LA 100 study and equity strategy, we'll take a look at new building decarbonization motions and see what that would mean for existing and new buildings. Great.
Thank you, Terry. And in addition to that, just looking ahead at the year, it's going to be a lot of fun. We are going to have later in the fall, we're going to have, I don't know if you've heard of the Climate Center, really good organization, does educational. We learn from them about certain kinds of legislation that we want to support. So we're going to have the executive director, Ellie Cohen, speak to us later in the fall. We're looking forward in September to hosting a climate book author. So that's going to be fun. And during the summer, we're going to focus on environmental justice. Okay, we are ready for our speaker. We're just so excited to have Dr. Stuart Sandin tonight. He's a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. His research addresses questions in which ecology can most effectively inform marine management. And he serves as the director of the Scripps Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation and tracks the work of 100 faculty and hundreds of students linked to the center whose research spans many topics. And it's funny, in preparing for this, he posed that because we were saying, well, we may have a lot of questions. We have a variety of questions. And then he said, well, I do this. It's like, okay, I'm sure you can handle all of our interests. He's the principal investigator at Sandin Lab. He has his own lab. And I found this quote that really seems to sum up his focus and commitment to his work. Quote, I firmly believe that novel and fundamental ecological discoveries are yet to be learned, and that such discoveries hold promise to enhance current management strategies. My research focuses largely on the ecology of coral reefs with the goal of finding effective management and restoration approaches for this imperiled ecosystem. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Sandin. Thank you so much. All right, take it away.
Well, thank you, Diana, for the introduction and reminding me of some of the goals that we have as a group. It's great to come and talk with you guys, and it gets me remembering my childhood. As I think Diana has pointed out, I'm a child of the San Fernando Valley. I was born in Encino. I went to high school at Taft High School, and I got my first introduction to wildlife by looking around the Santa Monica Mountains. I would ride my bicycle up the mountain and go ride around. Only one time did I make it all the way to the beach. That was an ambitious day, and I don't think that my mom was very happy when I told her I was in Malibu at the time. But I did learn quite a bit by being able to spend time outdoors. I fell in love with every element of nature. I got to see the various bugs and plants and birds that the Santa Monica Mountains hold. Never once did I see one of our famed mountain lions, but I always dreamt of seeing one of them up there. But I will say that as a child growing up in the valley, I did have some concerns and some eco anxiety, if you will. You imagine when I was a kid going to school, practicing for sports and such, the air quality was certainly not great. I recall that some of the fields that I would be playing at adjacent to the freeway right alongside the 101, and that was that period of time that we had yet to really start to control some of our emissions. You know, the emission standards were allowing our city emissions to go. Catalytic converters weren't yet required, and we still had leaded gasoline. I remember driving over the Sepulveda Pass and looking down into the valley and seeing the haze that could be there. And that's a geological phenomenon. Let's just be clear that is something that was there before humans were there. Well, I guess it depends on when in the ice ages we were talking about. But it is a dust phenomenon, but it was definitely exacerbated by people. I want to celebrate the idea that when I do drive north to visit friends and I get to the top of the Sepulveda Pass, I don't see that haze anymore. I see that the air quality in the valley itself is visually improved. And I don't think those stories like that of improvement, where we as a group of people taking initiative, leading to successes, are as rare as we think that they are. And in fact, they happen straight in front of our eyes oftentimes. I think one of the biggest challenges is simply being able to see those changes. The changes that are happening in our environment are oftentimes dramatic and fast. The things that happen to the detriment of the environment can be really striking and quick. When it comes to coral reefs, I would imagine that many of you have seen or have heard the story and have come across this coral reef narrative. Okay, so let me just tell you if you've not come across it. The coral reef narrative goes something like this. Corals are these beautiful animals that live on the bottom of the ocean in the tropics. If there's a rock and the water's warm and there's enough light, you'll get an animal that lands on it. That animal can grow up, it can pick up some friends, some algal symbionts, zooxanthellae, these things that help them to grow really fast. They've got a bunch of microbial friends that grow on top of them, and you get these incredible fields of coral. So they're rocks, they put rocks down and they create entire structures. Well, this is a snapshot from 1976, an image-based snapshot of a 4 meter by 2 meter area of coral reef in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. So if you go to a map of Jamaica, the north coast, the middle of it, and it's a pretty popular spot for scientists to be working. But scientists who are learning quite a bit about the biology of corals, the ecology, and all the wonderful organisms that live there, were also there at a pretty interesting time. They were able to tell this coral reef story. This was a friend of ours, Dr. Jim Porter, was one of these prescient individuals that was capturing change. He was using photographic time series underwater to try to capture the same location. And what I'll note here is this is 1976 with the year in the bottom left corner. And this is the same exact plot on the bottom of the ocean. If you look really closely in one of the images, you'll see a piece of steel that he pinned in here. So we know it's the exact same coral reef. Okay, Jamaica at this period of time had suffered, was experiencing really rapid population growth. There was a lot of fishing going on, so fish are being extracted. And at this point, some things started changing in the Caribbean as well. Diseases started to spread, and the climate was starting to shift. Between 1976 and 1980, there was a dramatic set of experiences of a widespread disease in one of the major corals, those branching corals we saw in the middle, and a huge hurricane, Hurricane Allen, came and devastated Discovery Bay. What was a vibrant reef now looks like this, was kind of scattered. Well, you go fast forward a couple years. What's going to happen? Corals are animals. Corals can grow quickly. And historically, people thought of corals as things that fouled harbors and led to challenges where we had to scrape them off the hulls of boats. Well, corals can only grow in places where there's space for them to grow. You need a rock, you need good light, you need this and that. And these little guys, these little spiky balls you see here, are sea urchins. And the sea urchins came to the rescue. They were starting to take over the landscape, clean off all the competitive muck. Just you imagine algae and things, you leave anything in the ocean and it starts to stink. These things were eating it, leaving space for corals to grow. And there were little corals starting to regrow in this location. But in 1983, later this year, there was another disease that swept through the Caribbean, and it killed not over 98% of all of these sea urchins from the entire Caribbean. And so between 1983 and 1986, we saw another shift to this ecosystem. What was a location that had lost a lot of the corals and now but still had some structure where the corals could grow, now is covered in this green muck. That's scuzzy stuff that happens if you leave something in the ocean. It's algae, it's a filamentous algae, it's everything that just, you see it on shorelines and such. Sure, it's food for a lot of animals, but if it's uncontrolled, it prevents a coral from growing. So what we watched happen in this one spot in Jamaica was a location that was captured with lots of corals. We had a big storm that we know is getting more because of climate change. We had diseases spread that we know is happening with climate change. And then we saw this wholesale transition in the period of 10 years to an algal wasteland. Now, that's the coral reef story. There are different permutations of it linked with ocean acidification and a number of other issues coming to bear. Well, we bumped into Dr. Jim Porter, the guy who had taken these photographs about 5 years ago. And we were trying to show him some work that we were doing. We were trying to use technology to capture change on coral reefs using images. And we were showing him some photos we'd taken. And he invited us to Jamaica. We went and we took photos. We went and found the same exact location. I'm going to pause this here for a second, if I can. There we go. I guess I can do that and pause it. We took photographs. We found the same exact location where he had worked before. You can recognize this coral that was there. You can recognize some different features. And we visit, and it was actually sort of a funny event because he's now in his late 60s, and he brought his graduate students that he had working with him 30, 40 years before. They were all investment bankers and such, and now getting in the water with them was a little scary because they hadn't been diving in a long time. But we went and found the same plots and we took images. You can imagine the technology gets a bit better with time. And now, rather than doing what are these mosaics, we were able to capture three-dimensional views of this coral reef. And now, yeah, we see a bunch of algae, but I want to point out something that was outrageously striking. This was striking to us. It was striking to our partners working in Jamaica. This coral colony, you can see this thing right here is a piece of steel that Dr. Porter had put into the reef 40 years before. It's the same exact coral. And this coral colony is there 50 years after he first identified it. The people at Discovery Bay, our Jamaican colleagues working there, were floored. The story goes that there should be no corals left. The story goes that the coral that existed 50 years ago has definitely died. There's no way that current conditions can support any corals. But the people in Jamaica are not giving up, and they haven't been giving up. And then seeing this coral exist from 50 years before, well, they got them thinking, hey, what is happening right I'm going to plant that seed simply to say corals aren't given up without a fight. And we even see it in a place that is the caricature and oftentimes put up as the poster child for this coral reef story. Okay, let me update that coral reef story with some work that we did about 15, pushing 20 years ago. Jamaica has suffered a lot of impacts because of rapid human population growth. And in fact, a lot of the Caribbean the coral reefs of the Caribbean are struggling because you've got a lot of pressures pushing both locally and in terms of climate issues. We wanted to, when I first showed up to Scripps, learn something about coral reefs that hadn't seen people, that had very limited human impacts. And now you'd think that that's impossible because we think, well, people live everywhere and tropical islands are beautiful, and you imagine people had been everywhere. Well, although we may have had people in many places, there are places in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that are uninhabited, that give us this benchmark for what a coral reef can look like if you don't have local impacts, if you don't have fishing, if you don't have pollution. Well, this was early on in my career, like I said, at Scripps. And at that point in time, we didn't really know how to find nice vessels. And this was literally the vessel we took. And if she looks a little shoddy right here, she looks great because she was very scary to be on. I take it back, the captain of this vessel was very competent, but it wasn't the premier research vessels like we have at Scripps. So I have to point out, this is not a Scripps-owned vessel, we chartered it. We went to these we had to get a ship to get to these islands, Kingman, Palmyra, and a couple islands in the northern Line Island archipelago. These islands, for context, here's Hawaii. So if you fly all the way to Hawaii, you still have to get on a ship for about 4 days to get down to these islands. Although they were visited by Polynesians and some Micronesians, the Kingman and Palmyra remain uninhabited. And we got an opportunity to see what reefs look like, but we also compared them with these islands down here. Islands with small populations. These are the islands of Christmas, Taboaran, and Taraina are all part of the Republic of Kiribati. If you haven't come across that country, it's spelled Kiribati. You may have read it, but it's pronounced Kiribati. It's President Tong, the 2 presidents ago, was really prominent for talking about not being a climate refugee, but is amongst the presidents and amongst the countries that is getting threatened to be flooded due to sea level rise. We went to these locations and we surveyed the reefs. And what did we see? Well, we saw locations that had some nice corals and we saw some little fish. This is a photograph from Taboaran, where it has a small population of people, about 2,500 people. And the people at that point were, they were artisanal fishers. They were subsistence fishers, just fishing from the reef just for food. But then we went from inhabited, from Christmas to Taboaran, up to Palmyra and Kingman. And this was a typical scene that we saw, with lots of fish in the location, lots of corals, and some fish that were particularly, they were particularly curious, like this red snapper here. This was a colleague of mine and a close partner in this work, Dr. Jennifer Smith, was literally trying to push this fish away from her with her camera when she took the photograph. Very interesting locations, but the story is best told in photographs. If we try to compare these islands, look at what's happening, and you go from an island like this, Christmas Island, Taboaran, Palmyra, and Kingman, from 5,000 people artisanally fishing, 2,500 people, nobody, but some historic disturbances with a military presence for a bit, and no disturbance. We see a very dramatic, a very stark change. And I should point out that I've spent a lot of time analyzing all the data from this cruise back, a decade ago. And the only thing people remember is this panel of photographs. Nobody cares about the data. This tells the whole story. In a place that has lots of fish, big fish, the coral reef looks beautiful. There's corals. And this pink stuff is a type of calcifying algae. It actually is a cement, a live cement that keeps the reef together. Same on Palmyra, lots of coral and this and that. As the fish start going away, you see more of that green stuff like we were seeing in Jamaica, more algae, less corals. And in a place like Christmas, this spot right offshore of the main town of London, we see that the reef just is scuzzy and filled with algae. This is without climate impacts. We're seeing the degradation of these coral reefs. Well, we've taken the examples from this coral reef story, combining it with this idea that in these uninhabited islands have these beautiful coral reefs, but then you get just a few people and you start watching some of the coral reefs go away. It gave me, again, that eco-anxiety, this idea that we had to just get rid of people if we were going to keep reefs around. Well, that's not the whole story. Take a little bit more of a geographic tour, and let's go now to Micronesia. This is the Federated States of Micronesia is a nation made of 4 different island states. This is Pohnpei, and Pohnpei, if you've heard of Non-Madol, which is the Venice of the Pacific, it's here in Pohnpei. And this atoll offshore is called Ant Atoll. We went to Ant Atoll working with some colleagues from a non-governmental organization called One Reef, a group working to try to protect the coral reefs, giving some infrastructure, financial and technological support to the leadership that was interested in increasing the protection, making a park, a marine park, around this atoll. Well, they were at the beginning phases of making this marine park, and we went in to support the science, to go see what the reefs look like. And we saw a reef that looked like this, and a reef that looked like this. Okay, I want to give you scale here. This is about 10 meters by 10 meters. Think of about half of a tennis court or a basketball court. You know, it's the big basketball playoffs time. So not just half of that area is this area. And everything you see here, these sticks, these mounds, these bumps, and these tables, these are all corals. And these are vibrant corals, and these are corals you don't see other places. And when you looked up close at places that didn't have coral, you get what you see up here in the top left, a bunch of little corals. These are babies. This is the next generation. And this was a location that we were told we had to start working with the local community and with the local leadership to increase protection, because the leadership thought that there was too much disturbance happening, too many people fishing, too much disturbance to the reef environment. But the reef was beautiful. And the reef was beautiful because of a person like this, Willie Hawley, the Rosa. He's the king of Pohnpei. In fact, the king of Pohnpei and Ant Atoll. And his dad and his dad's dad had been the Rosas before him. And and this is Rose Bain, his wife. His forebears had been lessening the protection. But with the support of these guys here, who are all part of the Conservation Society of Pohnpei, a local NGO that works to provide support on the marine resources, he was informed that the fisheries were dropping. People were fishing too much. He was told that corals were starting to die. And he realized that his dad had not been enacting the traditional respect about fishing in Ant Atoll. Everybody who fishes Ant Atoll has to ask for permission from the Rosa, and people were not. And so he stepped in and took action. And he took action before it was too late, and now the fish populations are growing back, and those corals are remaining. But this story was just inspiring for me, where I had thought by being in these islands of Kiribati that just a small population would devastate an island. I realized I was looking way past the signal that was there. I was seeing the negative and I wasn't seeing the positive. I wasn't picking up that Christmas island that I was showing you before that had the devastated reef. If you go a little ways away from town, the reefs were stunning and spectacular. I was missing out that local protections can matter and can keep reefs around. And I was missing out that there's not just one coral reef story. It was with that motivation that we began this project that Diana just shared with you that mentioned the 100 Island Challenge. It was our effort to understand a bit more about the variability of coral reefs across the globe. And our interest has been in trying to work out what's happening in reefs, what goes beyond this simple coral reef story and what's happening. And I'll give you the punchline. It's not all doom and gloom. These stories like the Rosa has been enacting are more common than we think. even in the face of a changing climate. I'll give you the second punchline. All of this effort of protecting the reefs will be inconsequential if we don't solve the climate problem in the next century. So we have local efforts that are working today for the climate situation as we stand today.
You froze a little, Stuart.
Yeah, sorry about that.
You're back.
Hopefully my internet is back. Am I back? Okay. Yeah. So what I want to the point there is we have the actions of groups, communities worldwide who have been protecting their reefs, and I think that we keep that going. And with a strong climate action, we will have reefs in the next generations. The 100 Island Challenge spans about 17 different countries. It goes from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, with a focus in the Pacific. And we go and we watch reefs worldwide. And what does that mean to watch reefs worldwide? You work with partners, and hopefully this video is not too glitchy. I know that Zoom videos are not the best, but hopefully it's okay. It's slow. So if it's okay and I'm not making you seasick, then we're okay. Though seasick could get you in the mood for like being in the water. The work that we do is to connect with our local partners. In every country, there are resource managers who are thinking about their coral reefs, that are spending time, that are learning about them, and that are taking that knowledge to implement it within society, take action, whether it's from citizens groups or from national leadership or traditional leadership. We work with them if they are doing in-water work, and we partner with them in the water. And then in the water, we try to give a snapshot of what does each reef look like. We spend time, looking at different elements of plots. We spend time with these clipboards in our hand, and we swim around and we count how many fish are there. We spend time working on what the bottom of the ocean looks like. And I'll show you, we use some technology that helps us to understand a bit more about what's happening. We look at the fish, and the fish are a big part of the story. The story in Jamaica was preordained a bit because of the rising population and the poverty of Jamaica that made fishing just a part of not having enough fishes to help protect the reef. And we can compare what reefs look like. This is the only, and we see here is the graph that I still wait for a call from Stockholm for my Nobel Prize. The islands that are shaded in gray have less fish because there are more people living here and fishing here. And the ones that aren't shaded have people that aren't living there and aren't fishing there. And there's more fish that live there. We know that if people fish, you get less fish. But the reason I show this is simply to say, even in the main Hawaiian Islands, where you have a lot of people and hopefully a few people have visited and seen the reefs there, you get a lot of variability. And it depends on how we manage, like down here in the Line Islands, how much fish we have in one location versus another. And we can change the height of this curve to get more fish. We also look at the bottom. We look to see what's growing there, and the coral reef would not be a coral reef were it not for our little friends here, the corals. But studying corals is a little bit more complicated than studying fish. Although fish, they say, are like trees, except they're invisible and they move. The corals are even harder because they're these colonial organisms that grow and break apart and grow over here. They aren't like trees in that they don't take a singular shape. They take whatever shape is available to them. They grow in different directions. And they grow over large expanses. To understand what's happening with a coral, we have to find new ways to study them. We've classically done it the same way of swimming around and just writing what I see. But with new technology, with good underwater cameras, and with computers that are accelerated because of the current fascination with video games, we can do a lot of work of archiving what's a coral reef. This is a three-dimensional model of that half a basketball court, but we can see individual corals, and this coral is the size of a $50 coin. That coral is the size of a quarter right there. These are tiny corals, but we can see them in a landscape that's a three-dimensional landscape with all of its friends there. I show the baby corals because it's always great thinking about babies, because babies are cute. But it's also great thinking about baby corals because they're the way that we're seeing the next generation of what's happening. And here we can see a constellation map of all the baby corals from this one location. And it's only possible because we have new technology. That new technology allows us to see this 100 square meters of reef in a visual we've never had before. We can look to see how many coral babies are there. And this is just a dot map of every baby that we found. In this case, about 200 babies in half a basketball court. That's incredible. We can look for all the adult corals and see how many there are, how big are they, and where are they placed. And you can imagine there's a ton of interesting science here. But we can also look at this landscape to find patterns we've never seen before, like this. We can look to see where this type of algae is. It's called halimeda. It's made of calcium. It's just really beautiful. It looks like a little bush. But when you map it out on a landscape, it looks like this. And I heard some stuff about bees. The algae itself makes these patterns that look something like a honeycomb, right? This is the distribution of it. And no one's ever seen anything like this before because we've never had these visuals that allow us to zoom out of a reef and zoom into a reef. This has been really fascinating for our friends thinking about the dynamics of coral reefs to understand how could you even create a pattern like this. Fascinating discovery still exists in these coral reef settings, and it's not a simple coral reef story. Okay, well, we can talk forever about spatial patterns, and I'd be happy to because I love it. That's a big part of the mathematical element that I think is just beautiful about ecology. But what we all care about is what tomorrow's going to look like. And tomorrow's not going to look like yesterday. And it's not going to look like today. You can take the same technology, we can start to watch. We can rewind time. This is a movie, created a 4-dimensional movie, if you believe it, because you got the 3-dimensional model, right? So you can kind of see the texture. It's a 3D model of this real coral reef that we took images. You can see that our bit of 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. So you're watching time as you go from left to right. And 2015 was a hot water event. We had a marine heat wave that led to coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is something where the corals die if it gets too hot. And the narrative goes, if coral bleaching happens, the corals die and don't come back. But if we go to the right here, we see a lot of these corals bleaching and growing back. Now, this is interesting, and this is novel. And this really has not been seen before. It's been seen in little places, but it's not in our literature, our canon of science, because everybody's just talking about it bleaching and dying. Something's happening with these reefs that's something different. This imagery is from Palmyra. It's one of these locations that has very few people, lots of fish, and lots of growth. But I want to investigate this a bit more and think about what can we see by watching things change through time? Is every story one of growth? No. Watch this table coral right here. A big storm comes through and it's gone. That entire feature that's the size of a dining table is flipped over, and here it is. And it devastated all that branching coral. You see it knocked around. But as we go to the right, watch all that coral grow back. Isn't that crazy? It's easy for us to watch loss because you can go to a location at one time point and see something that was alive be dead. But to watch things grow back takes years. It takes patience. Watching a forest grow is one of the least thankful things you can ever do because you won't ever see it grow. But we can watch it die. The island of Moorea, right next to Tahiti in French Polynesia. This is a way that we take 2 years, 2017 and 2019, and overlay them on top of each other. Everything that's green is a coral that wasn't there before. What happened was that in the early 2000s, there was no coral in this location. And in just about 10 years, all this coral grew back, and in just 2 years, that's how much more it grew. These corals can grow like crazy if given a chance to grow. And we can see this in spades with this example right here. Look at this. We just got back from the southern Line Islands, which is below where we saw Christmas Island, uninhabited islands of Kiribati. I was looking for a location to do the imaging. We put out these little markers to know where we are, little depth gauge, this and that. We have all this cool equipment. And when I went, I was like, shoot, this is the coral that we had put our tile on the year before, but I can't find the piece of steel that I put into it. We hammer this in, it's like we just hammer underwater to get this into, so we put a new piece of steel in. But then I looked around a little bit later and I saw this little thing right there. If you look underneath the cursor, the piece of steel is right there, and that's how tall it was 4 years before. This is a coral. It's made of solid limestone that grew about the size of your fist up in 4 years. Corals grow and can grow really fast in today's climate even, right? And the reason, and this thing is just unfathomable, this level of growth. We were excited to be in this location because this is now from Millennium in the Southern Line Islands, that in 2015-16, there's a marine heat wave. This used to be a big, live, vibrant coral, and it got killed by this hot water, and it was dead. And so when we saw this in 2017, we were just devastated. What had been a beautiful reef was now just gone. But we were there in 2021, I said, and that's what that reef looked like. And let me put the two side by side. In 4 years, an area that looked like this got colonized by a bunch of new coral colonies. The little corals that used to live there were now huge. And even some of the slow growing corals like this had become just a lot bigger. You give corals a chance and they can grow back. This is something that is the story that I think that we need to be getting to. Now, I tell you that we've been to a number of locations. We've captured those 100 islands. We've visited each of them. We're rounding out this project, visiting each of the locations at least 2 times. And we've seen a lot of variability, and we've seen a lot of spectacular reefs. If you've been to Hawaii, this is Kaho'olawe off of Maui and Maui Nui. Beautiful reefs just right offshore of Maui, even though it was bombed by the military for decades. We can go to Tonga and you see just wonderful reefs. All of these have their different character and their different flavor. But one thing that we're starting to see is that there are places that are bleaching and dying. There are places that are getting hot and the reef does die. But in those places, they grow back. And let me tell you where we're going from here. They grow back, but if they get hit by another hot water event after they've grown back, we're starting to see they don't die as much. Now, what's happening there? Same thing that happens with us, same things that happen with our plants and the weeds in our yard. Adaptation. Corals that are hit by hot water one time will die. The ones that survive have a bit more ability to survive hot water. They grow back. If the conditions are good locally, they grow back. If they aren't good locally, if we take too many fish, if we get into these situations like Jamaica, whatever, there's an example of it just going away and it hasn't grown back because there's just a lot of pollution right here in this spot here. But if we give them a chance to grow back, they will grow back. And when they grow back, they can grow back different. They can grow back stronger. And this is a phenomenon that we're seeing across the globe. Even there's some thinking that even our kelp forests are coming back growing differently after hot water events. After that big warm blob that we had down here, the water being super warm, the kelp coming back may have a capacity to weather higher temperatures. How exactly this is happening is a puzzle. How exactly it's happening is something that's a core area of inquiry for my lab group and a number of us at Scripps right now. But what we're seeing is right now that these corals, if given a chance, are growing really rapidly. And this is what human knowledge has had for generations, this understanding that corals grow. The reefs like this are not something that was built over millennia, but can actually assemble itself within centuries, if not decades. The direction that we're heading right now is to try to provide some new science that helps us to understand what adaptation is possible. How fast can that work? And are there ways that we as people can accelerate it? Can we take corals that are particularly resilient and in coral outplanting efforts use those? Can we protect locations that show more vibrancy? And can we get this information as a community, a global community, into the hands of folks that are using the knowledge, that are working day to day to keep the reefs around? In the 100 Island Challenge, we work with partners in lots of locations. And every location I go to, we start with a conversation about the coral reef story, about how bad reefs are, about the plight of them, and about how the last bleaching event caused problems. But once we have a longer conversation, once we have a shake hands and get to know each other, everybody pulls me aside and tells me a little secret. I know that reefs are going away, but you should see this reef over here. It's grown back. Hey, check out this spot. This spot is pretty special. It's outside of our nuclear power plant, but there are corals there. Can we talk about these special things, these locations that have a bit more of a story to them, a bit more of a flair, and are showing a bit more resilience? Those are the stories I love talking to my colleagues about, spending time learning from, and we're taking a bunch of time trying to work out how resilient can these reef systems be through generations, not just today, but into the generations ahead. And let me just end with one thought, that the local efforts that we're taking to protect reefs are working locally. But let me just reiterate what I said. It's not going to work unless we solve the climate issue. But we've got about a century, I think. And I know that sounds heretical. I know most people are saying that a lot of the problems are that. Well, I'm gonna say, if we don't have it fully resolved in a century, we will lose reefs. If we don't slow things down, if they keep accelerating, we maybe have 50 years. But if we do start decelerating some of the climate stuff, and we keep supporting our partners worldwide, we will have coral reefs in the future. All right, thanks a lot, everybody.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. You know, one of the questions we always like to end with, but I'm going to start with it, is what actions can we take to support the coral reefs as individuals? And what can we do as a chapter to support you? And as you answer that, I'm just going to turn the chat on for everyone. So if you could please, in the chat, pose the question that you would like for Dr. Sandin to answer. So go ahead and start your questions. If you could tell us, though, what we can do as individuals and as a group to support this.
Yeah, number one, keep doing what you're doing, because what I saw in the chat there was phenomenal. You know, I have inspiration now for the next convening we have of our Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, making sure that we each are talking about our individual initiative. But let me generalize that a little bit. Say that I think the most important thing that we need to do is to find efficiency in our life. And that sounds, sorry, I'm an academic and I might be a little nerdy, but what I mean by efficiency is to not be wasteful. And there are so many ways that we as individuals cannot be wasteful. We talk about that in terms of our energy use. We can talk about it in terms of our consumption. We can talk about it in terms of our the waste stream, and we can talk about it in terms of the demands that we put on the community around us. If we think about a lighter footprint, we all win. And when we start looking at the statistics of you guys know this probably better than I do about the per capita footprint of an American versus the rest of the world, it's just incredible. Right? How much we per capita cost or use resources. If we think about minimizing resources, we're going to start to address the climate issue, because we're going to be minimizing our energy. We will be minimizing the waste. If we aren't throwing away food, that's a huge part of our climate demand. And like I'm saying, the most important thing is we address both the climate and the local conservation issues for coral reefs.
I think that's very smart, and you're right. I mean, it's specific and in general, sort of, but it will make a difference in the specific situation. I wanted to ask. I remember reading. I want to say it's the Seychelles Islands, but I could be wrong. That there was a biology lab where they were on the land side. They were growing coral in a lab, and then transplanting it down in, underwater to help build and grow. Have you heard of anything like that? Is that a practice that's being done, or is it just an experimental thing?
Worldwide, this is happening, and people are. They'll refer to this as coral restoration, a whole bunch of different terms. The notion being in locations that there used to be coral, that they all died, maybe we can just put it back, sort of like we've restored forests after we cut them down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They work in some places, right? You can, if a coral died because of a shipwreck, and then you put a coral back there, it'll grow.
Mm-hmm.
But if a coral died because the environment went sour, whether it's sour because of the ocean chemistry, or sour because of it getting too hot, or sour because of pollution, and you just put a baby out, it's not going to do too well, right? We have to change the fundamental conditions before we try restoration efforts.
Right.
In places where we have, the Dominican Republic has a phenomenal amount of coral restored. The Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, that's the Caribbean side of Belize, Honduras, and Mexico. That reef there is growing back in pretty dramatically because of the efforts of local community groups that are planting out some of these rare corals, because they added fisheries protection to the puzzle. They've done a coordinated effort to try to link outplanting with a local protection. Is it going to scale globally? I used to think it had no impact on our future because it had such a small footprint. How many things can we dive around and put out? But there are locations where we've seen entire coastlines start to regrow. In some cases, we've seen some really dramatic positive impact from restoration efforts.
And I'm assuming that your work and your research is being shared with the global community around this, right?
Yeah. We try a few different things, and I start with this, that my first, if you think of us as being as serving clients, just use that terminology. I see our first client being our partners. I mean, we are working with resource management groups, with leadership that has a responsibility to work and to manage these natural resources for the next generation. We first service them, and we offer whatever access to the open, and that's a big thing. Are the data available? So they can call us and have every bit of data that we have. But then from there, we create scientific reports. We work with we work to produce the data and distribute it that way. And we work with media groups. We have had, newspaper and things like that. We try to share that. And so every form of communication we try to get to, from personal to global. Great.
And one question from viewers, how has toxic waste dumping into these coral reef areas affected them? And if it's no longer dumped near the reefs, is there evidence that the reefs spring back?
Yeah. Okay. So toxic waste. So let's just think about three. I'll really break that into kind of three different types of waste. If it's like toxic, like heavy metals and things like that, certainly stays in the food web, right? So if it gets into a reef, it percolates in. It's going to be in the organisms. It's going to make the fisheries, if there's a local community for cultural reasons or for subsistence reasons, eat it. You're going to get that issue. One thing, it's an awful rhyme to say, but it's a real one, that dilution is the solution to pollution. In many cases, these reef systems are small relative to the ocean, the huge ocean around them, and there's oftentimes a lot of loss from the system, that things wash away. We see evidence of the other two types of waste. There's that type of stuff. You can have radioactive waste, and we've definitely picked up signals of radioactivity from, say, the atolls in the Marshall Islands, where they had done tests after the war. You can still see it. It doesn't affect the kind of day-to-day biology or ecology, but there's a signal. You can still see that there's a bomb. The other one is more sewage. It's more the kind of day-to-day waste that we have. Now, day-to-day waste that may go through untreated, undertreated, or poorly directed waste streams can enter the reef environment. And I was telling you about that, the algal scuds that can take over a reef. Well, it can happen because there's no fish or sea urchins around. It can also happen because there's too much waste coming in. And we see places, even places that you may know, in the Hawaiian Islands, there's been a ton of debate or a discussion about the sewage treatment, because even though it's not microbial, it's not gonna get you sick, the nutrients are put onto the reef, and it's led to a bunch of corals dying. And it became a point of contention for the Clean Water Act even. That discussion about whether or not the sewage injection wells in the island of Maui were legal or not. There's clear evidence that they're hurting the reef, but it became this point of contention as to whether or not to keep the Clean Water Act going. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was wrote the majority opinion that kept the Clean Water Act in place with that ruling. And in fact, my close colleague here, Dr. Jennifer Smith from Scripps, provided the science and the advice to the lawyers that argued that case. So it was really exciting to see this evidence about sewage having a direct impact on a reef. That's the day-to-day waste, the day-to-day pollution, influencing it, and then having to get updated and treated because science told a clear story.
Interesting. Michelle, I'm going to ask you to help pull some questions. So why don't you post?
Yes, we have a question from Joanne for Dr. Sandin. Is there a formula you use to help reefs, for instance, more fish, larger fish, less pollution, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great one. The basic formula is exactly that. Make sure that there's enough fish around. Make sure locally that we don't dump sewage right on top of it. And then make sure that we don't step on it. We don't have ships crashing into it. I mean, it sounds really simple, this algorithm, but that's what we're going for. And there are different people that have tried to set thresholds, how many fish, how much pollution, and things like that. You know who knows the answer? There's so much variability from location to location. There's not one society of Pompeii. The people that know are the folks that work for the that work at the research laboratories on Moorea. The people that know are at Karmapi and Curacao. The folks that work with that reef environment that are providing the advice to the local governing agencies, and they're the ones that have their finger on the pulse of, do we have enough or too little? And so I give my the data and the information and observations to those groups, and I look to them to set where that knob should go, because everybody, most everybody's going to do better if they have a vibrant coastline.
Fantastic. And a question from Kathy. What effect does tourism have on the reefs, and how can it be mitigated? Tourism's a mixed bag. If I were to come down and say, do I think it's more good than bad? I come down fully on the side of good. Tourism gets people, ecotourism is wonderful. It gets us all understanding a natural resource. It gets us loving that natural resource, and it brings a value to that natural resource. For coral reefs, a lot of the folks that are in communities living around them have oftentimes a dependence on tourism dollars for economic viability. A lot of our colleagues really did suffer over the last couple of years because the entire island's economy shut down because of COVID enacted travel bans. So in fact, I'm talking with a lot of colleagues just, in these management organizations that are like, look, we aren't working yet because we have no money because they didn't get tourism revenue. Well done tourism with effective policies are going to lead to more resources, then more care that the reef looks nice, more care that their forest looks nice, and then you end up with a better managed system. What are some of the offshoots of too much tourism? You know, very popular dive sites in places where people are learning to scuba dive, the corals get smushed. In locations where there's a very charismatic organism like a seahorse, everybody wants to get a photograph, and everything around that seahorse gets kicked. You know, you see local impacts, absolutely. And so I'm not saying it's all done with only just like a pretty bow on top. There are some costs like every decision that we make. But by and large, the finances that go along with well-controlled, well-managed, and supported tourism, I think overwhelm some of those impacts.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Tessa asks, what is your position on deep sea mining as a strategy to find the minerals we need to support renewable energy? And then part two of that question, are fish that are supported by coral reef ecosystems consumed by us in the US? And can education and consumption by fish help us?
Okay.
So
yeah. Yeah, so the first part, deep sea mining, the deep sea is such a wonderful, variable, and a rich environment, biologically rich environment. It's also a fabulously important carbon sink. We should never forget about the value of the deep sea as a carbon sink. With the carbon that falls down stays there on the order of millennia. Rather than the order of just like, you know, days to months that is in shallow waters. Mining disturbs all that. Mining disturbs the biodiversity, it disturbs the ecosystems, and it disturbs that carbon sink. I see a lot of costs to that without a ton of benefits. I understand that some of these rare minerals are our target with deep sea mining. But we are finding already today alternatives for them, alternative locations for gathering them or using them, or even alternative elements. So I think it comes down to us pushing on the technology and not just feeling complacent that that's an okay way to go. Because I do think there's some real environmental costs and climate costs that we need to take into account before we make that decision, or as we make that decision. So that's my professional hat on. When I take it off, I would say I vote against it. Okay, now professional hat.
So someone mentioned earlier that they had seen chasing coral, and that was hard to see. And they mentioned the Great Barrier Reef. Can you give us an update on the Great Barrier Reef, or we should call it the Great Barrier Sink, I guess. Is
Yeah, so the Great Barrier Reef's been such a great story. It's been so educational for everybody. You know, that not only is it the biggest reef habitat on the planet, a coral reef seen from space, it gives us all the hyperbolic statements that make us both fall in love with and feel terrible about the world around us, right? The Great Barrier Reef has seen some recent dramatic hot water events, right? And seen a number of them this millennium. Ones that, you know, there were hot water events, these marine heat waves, and there was evidence of coral bleaching even a century ago. It was a thing, right? This isn't new. It's a part of the physiology of a coral. It gets too hot, the algae that live inside of the coral get too productive, the inside of the coral becomes too toxic because you have too much going on. Just imagine you exercise way too much and your muscles hurt, but then you keep exercising. So all those like free radicals start going nuts. And then somehow either the alga leaves or the coral kicks it out, right? And the coral doesn't have any pigment, so it's clear. So when it leaves, you only see the skeleton underneath. That's why it's called coral bleaching. You see white because it's just like this goo on top of limestone. The barrier reef's been really dramatic because it got these hot water things. And it hit whole areas, not the whole reef, but it'd be large sections. And it's huge and it's devastating. It's part of the story of this millennium, right? And it's going to be really hard to swallow. The other side of the story is these areas, after they die, the well-managed areas have grown back. They have, and this is something that gets a little bit less press because we're good at seeing rapid change that's obvious, and we're bad at watching slow recovery. We simply don't record it, we don't communicate it. So there's a a bias in the way that we observe information. Is there less coral today than there was in the year 2000 on the Great Barrier Reef? Yes. It did not grow back all the way. But we're seeing in these locations this regrowth pattern in different regions. Right now, there's another slight bleaching event, and there are sites that are just getting hit. But you know what's also hurting the Great Barrier Reef that we aren't thinking about are the way we're using the land, the rivers, and importantly, the mining operations. The bulk of the reef that's the Great Barrier Reef that's dying and probably will never be reef again is where the mining tailings are coming out of the rivers and making these giant plumes that are just sedimenting and suffocating the reef. That's the part of the story that we don't hear as much, the suffocation, the local impacts, and we don't hear as much about the regrowth and thinking about what is possible there. But this adaptation story is happening. I was just in Australia, well, before the pandemic, and people are seeing
You're cut out there, at least for me. I hope what you were saying is that people are seeing an improvement. Is that what you were saying? That
yeah, I was there. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know why my internet decided to be problematic right now.
No.
I figure all my Zoom meetings, it should be problematic when I don't want to be there.
Right.
I was saying that, Diana, yes,
Okay.
that they're seeing evidence of regrowth and adaptation.
That's good news. Do you know anything about the cruise line development at Lighthouse Point, and are the Lighthouse Point reefs in danger?
I don't know. Right now, I'm feeling like I should know where Lighthouse Point is, and I'm somehow thinking, what country are we in now?
Yes, I don't know. That was Christy's question, so I don't know, Christy, if you want to clarify or not on that.
Disney Cruise Lines is putting in a new cruise line, and I keep getting, I can tell you exactly where it is. I keep getting like 1 million petitions to sign to keep them out of it. In the Bahamas, Lighthouse
Okay.
Point in the Bahamas.
I see.
The petitions that we're getting are saying that the new cruise line development is going to destroy the endangered coral reefs there.
Yep, they aren't wrong. So here's the what happens with the. I don't know the details of this one location, but let me tell you about a place where I've spent about 25 years working, which is down in the island of Curacao. I did my PhD research down there, and I've watched a lot of change. That's the Southern Caribbean, just above Venezuela, next to in between Aruba and Bonaire. They've increased their cruise ship activity. In that case, not building ports, but building mega piers that can support the cruise ships. The idea that it gets sold as is that there'll be a lot of tourism dollars that'll come with that. And what's told as is if there's some damage, it'll regrow and we'll mitigate it. Well, when you build in the ocean, dredging operations and all that does lead to a big halo of change. Like when we do this work, we change the whole landscape. We have to be intentional when we build ports because you're going to destroy that habitat. And the reef is going to be restructured. That's not a few year, that's not a couple decade restoration. That's like centuries. But that's a relatively small footprint. If we care about it, if we need a port, we need a port, and that's something that human growth is part of the whole puzzle. The other side is that what do the cruise ships themselves do, and are they giving that economic viability? Okay, so first off, is there an environmental problem? The regulations say that the waste from the cruise ships has to be, held on and then pumped on shore. It can't go offshore, but some cruise ships violate that. And there's been some publicized events about that. The economics are where it gets more disturbing for me. The economics are thinking that the cruise ship passengers are going to be bringing dollars to that island nation. But the reality is that and this happened in Curacao, that the bulk of all the tourism dollars get controlled by the cruise owners, right? They start to control the tours, they control the taxis, they control even the goods that are sold. The extreme version of that is the stands on Curacao that sell little trinkets or whatever that say Curacao on it for the passengers leaving, walking around, and then getting back on. You turn it over, first off, not made in Curacao, but secondly, those goods come out of the bottom of the ship on pallets and then are set up and then are bought by the passengers and then go back on the ship. And this is something, and so you can see how, of course, it makes a lot of corporate sense. If you own a cruise liner, why not try to control as many of those dollars as you can? You're getting charged for a Coca-Cola or whatever on a cruise ship, like why not cruise do that? So the economics are tough, and the problem is that it's oftentimes incentivized, and I hate to say this, but by corrupt policies, right? A lot of the small islands have difficulty with transparency in their legal systems, and so despite the best intentions, these elements can get through. And for smaller nations, that have less money, even if there is an interest in there being some marine policy that could help to litigate against that, there's oftentimes not even the law on the books. So you have to write the law to even manage a marine resource. It's not in everybody's legal legal capacity. And so some of the partners we work with, Ted Waite, who's in Los Angeles, he now lives in Los Angeles, who's with leadership of island nations to make sure they have the legal support in addition to the different forms of scientific and financial support for their management goals.
Just looking at the time, I feel like we could go on, but I just we need to wrap it up. But I'll wrap it up with one last question, if we can. You made such a clear point to sort of establish that there's a formula to use. That the more fish in the area, the healthier the reefs. Is there a way that we can advocate to stop overfishing?
Yeah.
You have 30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
Why is this the last question at 8:20 at night? This is the hardest question. The answer to that is that's it's always the sticking point. For us to be respectful stewards of nature, the hard work is the day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year work. It's how do we maintain this relationship between people who may want to use a resource and in most cases overexploit a resource, and then people who aren't going to. It's all, the negative change is fast. You can build up whatever fish population you want, and if somebody brings a net through and pulls them all out, they're gone, and you have to wait a decade to rebuild it. So how do you do it? You have to think about it in the long term. We have to build a community of trust. We have to build a culture of respect, and we have to reinforce what has been in the human DNA for generations, which is one of stewardship, of thinking year to year. And you think about the different communities that, there was that beautiful opening thinking about the history, the human history of the San Fernando Valley, and the way that we as humans use the resources. And there was more thought to that. I remember going to some of the old, if I remember right, there were some like petroglyphs and such in the valley that I think I remember seeing at some point as a kid, probably illegally on someone's property. Sorry if it was your property. But I remember seeing some of this stuff and just thinking about what was the relationship with nature and how could you make it through without that somebody shipping food in. It would be a tough place to find enough food and not to overuse it. So this is something that has to get embedded into our culture, and it's something that we have to respect and not just chase quick, hopeful, like quick wins with environmental conservation, but instead embrace that it's going to be a generational, intergenerational, and consistent cultural shift. Mm-hmm. And one that we can't just do once and be done with.
Keep doing it. Yeah. Well, I'm going to actually remove the pin, go back into gallery Brady Bunch mode. So everybody feel free to unmute and say thank you to Dr. Sandin. That was just really
Thank you.
beautiful. So
Okay.
thank you very much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Sandin.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
really appreciate it.
It's a great conversation. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for attending tonight. Really appreciate it. Wasn't he good? I just thought that was so nice. All right, you guys, take good care and look forward to seeing you next time.
You. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.